stakes just got higher in the US-China trade war. China announced 90 minutes ago it will put tariffs on $60 billion of US imports if Donald Trump goes ahead with the new 25% tariffs on $200 billion of Chinese goods, more than double the original 10%. Meanwhile, the US-China Business Council has called on the US administration to enter into dialogue instead of using tariffs. So where do we go from here? Welcome to The Point. I'm Cheng, sitting in for Liu Xin. The US may raise tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese imports to 25% instead of the original 10%. The Trump administration has also said the US is ready to engage with China in negotiations. In response, China has decided to impose additional tariffs of 4 different rates on about $60 billion of imports from the US. That's according to the Commerce Ministry, and it happened about 90 minutes ago. Where does that put the trade war? Joining me in the studio is Mr. James Ray, visiting scholar at the Beijing Foreign Studies University, and in Geneva, Wallace Cheng, China Director of the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development. Welcome, gentlemen. Let me start by asking both of you, I guess you first, James, considering the latest events, the latest retaliatory action from China, or actually the threat of retaliation from China, what's it likely to provoke from, what's it likely to get in terms of response from the US?
I think President Trump has decided this is a long-term strategy to see China as a growing threat and not really seeking negotiations. And from the original meeting where China agreed to try to purchase more American products, and then that was ignored, and then the tariffs went into effect, and there was no real opportunity for dialogue at that point, and now escalating to this 25% tariff. I think it's only natural for China to reciprocate with comparable tariffs, but I don't think this is a short-term tactic. I think this is a long-term plan. Trump doesn't have advisors that are going to walk him back to a pro-trade position, so I think we're in this for at least the next couple of years.
Do you agree with that, Mr. Cheng?
Well, there are many different observations about this escalation of trade tensions. I personally still believe there's room for negotiations for both sides. When the escalation reached to a point that both sides cannot bear it more, probably it's time to have a highest level negotiations between President Xi and Trump to have a talk. Really, what is the bottom line you cannot touch, and where are the common ground we can reach agreement?
I've heard things similar to that in the past few days from China-US experts. Mr. Ray, do you think that's going to happen, a Xi-Trump summit on this anytime soon?
Trump is full of surprises, as we know, meeting Chairman Kim of North Korea. But there's been ample opportunity. Last year was a very successful year in US-China relations, and Trump had a team that was more in favor of somewhat multilateralism and free trade. And then this February, with the resignation of Gary Cohn as the real chief voice for trade, the anti-China or the very critical of China advisors are now ascendant. There's really very few people there to walk him back from what his own instincts are, which is very much in favor of this kind of win versus lose zero-sum game. And of course, leading up to the midterm elections, there's no incentive to make a deal, since the Democratic Party is also in favor of fairly harsh tariffs. So I don't think in the short run we have a solution. I think as China reciprocates, which goes against the US negotiating team's position of no right to reciprocate, I think it will just continue to escalate. And of course, there's always the opportunity for negotiations, but I'm not very confident about that.
Okay, let's talk about the possible response from the business community. Public hearings on tariffs for the $200 billion of Chinese goods would take place later this month, and then that's going to drag on for another few weeks. What factors will be considered? And now we've got these possible tariffs from China on US goods, and I had a look at the list of 5,200 products, everything from tequila, vodka to dental floss and specialized vehicles. What's that going to do to these US exporters? Mr. Cheng?
Well, I think that is a more technical issue. To emphasize that just comment previous one speaker said that although there's difficult time before midterm election to have this negotiations, but I think that China need to make a point that negotiation is not about market opening or not about how I import more. It's about what kind of new rules you want. It's a negotiation about rules. Then there are space, I think, for China. China understand that the SOE reforms for its own interest, public more fair competition, and also U.S. has its demand. But we need to make it clear: it's not whatever you want, we will give to you. Let's come to the negotiating tables about what kind of rules you want, what kind of rules we want.
But these rules would take months, if not years, to implement or to standardize and then to implement. Would you agree, Mr. Ray?
Well, I mean, we have the WTO system. We have all sorts of rules on intellectual property, and China's been, without a doubt, moving increasingly toward those opening and reforms over the last 20 to 30 years. And the world has recognized those opportunities for investment in China, for trade. This type of hostile insulting of China is not going to work. And even from the very first trade mission to China of the Trump team in February, said you can't have any role for state-owned enterprises and you have no right to reciprocate, which to me is sort of like a 19th century gunboat diplomacy. It sort of forced China's hand to reciprocate in the way that just occurred again today. So we have the system of rules. We have most countries observing it, and the country that could lead the way, the United States, sort of breaking apart the system and not really having faith in what multilateral institutions can do, and China building its own multilateral institutions and moving still further toward the reforms that were just mentioned.
So do you think the global economic order, such as it is in jeopardy? And, you know, is it going to be replaced by a new order, Mr. Cheng?
So within U.S., I think there's also the counter-argument, counter-weight, let's say, just as you described, about how to evaluate Trump's move. There are still lots of people, particularly intellectual area, like Nobel Prize winners, they kind of criticize his move, which put the multilateral rules, put the rule-based system behind, which is a very big mistake for the U.S. economy, also for the U.S. stance in the global stage. I think that part of counterweight we still cannot neglect. We hope that within the U.S. the debate will continue going on. And although China is, as previous one already said, that they have bipartisan kind of agreement of China bashing, blame China for every problems in U.S., which need to be corrected in the longer term. But I think in the short and mid term, there is still debate going on in the U.S. We hope that the debate will move into a right direction to come back to the multilateral negotiation table to try to agree on the new rules and to rely on this rule-based multilateral system. Although it is slow, but it is stable. This is the best thing available to avoid the worst.
Mr. Ray, do you think comments from Nobel-winning economists and other academics and even formerly trusted advisors are going to have any bearing on what Trump does?
No, I think he has said virtually every president has failed in North Korean policy, failed toward China, failed on Iran, and so he doesn't seem to value the former president's experiences of either party. He has great confidence in his unique ability to judge people and to win in this kind of chaotic state, and he certainly has created chaos, and he's certainly comfortable with chaos, but I don't think that's a recipe for achieving a negotiated settlement. Certainly with China, that wants to be respected on the international stage, is the second largest economy, is going to be the driver of growth. This is not the time, and of course President Trump won't be president for 2 or 6 more years. We'll wait and see. I would imagine any future president, Republican or Democrat, will move back to the consensus in America in favor of multilateralism and free trade. So it's in President Xi's incentive to wait out this chaotic period.
Speaking of waiting out, China's central bank, and this happened just 2 hours ago, the central bank tightening yuan trading rules to stabilize the currency. And that was after the yuan touched as low as 6.89 to the dollar this week. What role do you see the currency playing in the trade war? Mr. Cheng?
Well, the currency have two sides of this issue. First is, I think, still because of the market confidence in the yuan has dropped because of the tension of the risks of escalating the trade tensions into a full-scale war. I think that is one response. But secondly, I think also yuan has been overvalued already. So there's a market tendency with or without this trade tension, I think is going to be depreciated.
Okay, let's talk about the art of putting together a list of goods to attract tariffs. I mean, the US list has about 6,000 items worth $200 billion, including chemicals, minerals, consumer goods. You know, why these items and how is that going to affect US consumers, Chinese exporters and multinationals doing business here? James?
Well, certainly early on, I think the targeted industries that China focused on in agriculture and automobiles that were in key swing states that will decide the midterm elections and the next national election were very clever. I think the U.S. had sort of a broad-based scheme, but has been a little bit more nuanced in its approach now. But certainly in the U.S., these industries will continue to put pressure on President Trump and on Congress. And consumers, as they start to feel the pain, will start to press as well. So I think there are domestic factors that could limit how far President Trump can go. And of course, in China, I think there's more insulation. There's already high value-added taxes. The reciprocal tariffs, I don't think will press quite as hard in China.
Mr. Cheng, the Trump administration is urging China to stop its unfair practices, open its market and engage in true market competition. I guess in terms of opening the market, China has announced quite a slew of measures of late. You know, what else could China do?
That's a very good question. So I think China has taken, let's say, two-steps approach. First is to fully implement the commitment it made 18 years ago when it entered to the WTO. I think that in general, I think in principle, the performance is good. Even previous Director General of WTO would like to give a B plus or A minus, which is fairly objective, I think. So the next step, I think not only many people also believe that this wave of kind of foreign pressures from U.S. or from European unions about this leveling play field also reflect some domestic thinking. What should be the next direction? What should be the direction for next wave of domestic reform? I think some of them are in the right direction. Let's say the SOEs, inefficiency, monopoly in the market, which kind of squeezed out, cried out private investment in competitive sectors, and also in terms of the government massive state interventions. I think to some extent, many industry policies are wasteful, are not efficient, has not been successful in supporting innovation.
Yes, and doing all of that would definitely be good for the
so
Chinese economy
in these two areas,
in the long run.
Reforms.
Yes, absolutely right. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you so much to our guest, James Ray, visiting scholar at Beijing Foreign Studies University, joining us in Beijing, and in Geneva, Wallace Cheng, Director of the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development. We are taking a short break. Next, we'll be hearing the U.S.-China Business Council's comments on American companies' concerns in doing business in China. Stick around. You're back with The Point. Amid escalating tensions, the U.S.-China Business Council released its new submission to the U.S. Trade Representative, calling on the Trump administration to address American companies' concern via dialogue instead of tariffs. But Is he ready to reverse his policies and talk? And could the latest export restrictions on Chinese tech companies be the start of a Cold War? Earlier, I spoke to Jake Parker, Vice President of China Operations at the U.S.-China Business Council, and Huang Shan, Deputy Managing Editor of Caixin Media. I started by asking Jake whether he thought a trade war had been what the U.S. CBC had been expecting all along.
I think when we talked to our member companies, what we had hoped from the beginning was not that tariffs would be used, but that the two sides could come together to discuss the very real issues that President Trump raises in the 301 investigation, particularly intellectual property rights protection and reducing forced tech transfer. The 301 case does raise important issues, ones that our companies are very much supportive of, but we don't believe that tariffs are the right tactic for dealing with these very challenging issues.
So what would be the right tactics, Mr. Huang Shan?
My sense is that definitely, because I think different methodologies when it comes to what's the best way to bring both sides to the negotiation table. Because US say they want to use the tariffs to pressure China to come to the negotiating table, but China say will not bow under any pressure from the US side. I think it's really different methodologies about how both sides can restart or resume the negotiations. So I think the best way for both sides to come to the negotiation table is to really allow calm heads prevail in both capitals.
So now it's been almost a month since those tariffs on $34 billion worth of Chinese goods, and then China retaliating. Where are we, and how have your, to both of you, have your perceptions changed in the last couple of months with respect to the time frame of these current trade tensions? Jake, you first.
Sure. I think when we look at the implemented 34 billion tariffs to date, what we're seeing is the impact that it's having on U.S. member companies that are operating in China. Those that have a supply impact are beginning to look at shifting the country of origin away from China, where they may have existing unused capacity, say in Brazil or the European Union. For those that are unable to shift that country of origin, they'll look at passing on some of those tariffs costs to their customers and suppliers, and as a last case resort, they'll take that as a hit on their margins here in China and abroad. For those with a sales impact, they're looking at instead the ability to be able to pass on these costs both to their suppliers and consumers, and the potential again to be able to relocate manufacturing operations offshore from China in the medium term. Ultimately, it comes down to how long companies think that the trade conflict between the U.S. and China will last. If there's a concerted view that this is going to be a medium to long-term issue, then they'll begin looking at seriously relocating their operations outside of China. And I think that's something that the Chinese government is beginning to notice. We've heard from some of our member companies recently that Chinese government regulators have invited them in to talk about how the tariffs are impacting their supply chains, what effect it's having on their local manufacturing operations in China, and in some cases, how the Chinese government can support, whether through preferential policies or subsidies, to help offset some of those risks. So I think that the Chinese government is taking these tariffs very seriously and looking at how this might impact China's economy both in the short and medium term, but also very concerned about what shifting supply chains out of China might mean for China in the long term.
Mr. Huang, you as a fellow member of the media, I mean, business reporters have just been kept so busy the last couple of months, and this will probably continue. So how have your engagements with Chinese business people and US business people with regard to how to respond to these changes?
So actually, I think definitely the trade war is a lose-lose situation for both countries. But definitely, I think China will suffer more from the trade war because we actually had a disproportionate position to rely upon the U.S. export market, because everybody knows that the trade relationship between these two countries are very unbalanced, right? So, but definitely, I think if you look at the U.S. context, you will see actually the U.S. the inflation we have seen, the U.S. inflation rate has been picking up, and definitely if the tariffs really take root and really I think definitely impact a range of U.S. goods imports. So definitely will really deteriorate the make the situation worse in the U.S. Inflation situation. So I think definitely it's a lose-lose situation both countries. And in China, I think definitely if you look at the recent Politburo meeting, so the government really announced a range of issues try to deal with the uncertain, kind of headwinds when it comes to the external pressure. So my sense is that against backdrop of a range of these measures, definitely China's economy will come to kind of a sound footing, and really we rely upon pro-growth measures to boost domestic consumption, and number one, and number two definitely will increasing some spending in infrastructure. So I think these domestic measures, a combination of measures, will sort of dilute the impact from the external outside pressure.
So, Jake, with the news now that it's going to be 25% tariff on $200 billion of Chinese imports instead of 10%, and China responding that blackmail is not going to work and that it would hit back. I mean, you're already talking about companies seeing tougher approvals and so on. So, is that going to get worse?
Well, it certainly will get worse. It's 15% worse just on the base of it. When we look at the $200 billion, this is going to have a much broader impact on the American consumer. I agree with Professor Huang that the biggest impact of imposing tariffs is not on harming China, but on harming the American consumer, the American farmer, and American industry. And that's going to be felt a lot more in the $200 billion numbers because many, many more consumer products are included there. It's also much more difficult for U.S. companies who source in the China market to be able to diversify their supply chains for things like bedding and furniture, because these are products that are effectively only manufactured in China at the type of scale that our companies are able to sell into the U.S. market. So we're going to see a much bigger impact on consumers if the $200 billion go into effect as they're currently written, and that's going to begin to hit their pocketbooks on the ground in the United States.
And Mr. Huang, Shan, do you see that hitting the order books of Chinese companies, Chinese exporters?
Definitely. I think China's exporters will definitely suffer a lot because actually people know that we got the $500 billion export U.S. market, and the U.S. actually is the largest the source of our trade surplus. And so my worry actually is that if we cannot allow the situation to stabilize near time soon, so the trade war will definitely deteriorate into kind of a currency war, and even as you mentioned at the beginning of the conversations, that new type of a Cold War. I think this is the situation nobody across the Pacific Ocean really want to see, particularly those for China hands. So I think we really try to limit the impact of the trade war, but what's the most important thing now is for both sides is how to bridge the methodological gap between two capitals.
Yeah, that's a tough one, because Jake, you were telling me that these days China hands, US hands, they have less influence with the respective governments, and also they're getting less opportunities to engage. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. The President Trump and his trade team, some of whom have significant history dealing with China and with dealing with U.S.-China bilateral trade issues, they're fairly clear on the priorities and objectives for which the Trump administration will pursue. The U.S. business community has clearly indicated to President Trump and his administration on multiple occasions that tariffs are not what the U.S. business community is seeking, and that it will ultimately do more harm than good to the American economy, consumer, and farmer. However, there's a feeling in the Trump administration today that there's a need to develop additional leverage to be able to support stronger negotiations with the Chinese going forward. There's also a general feeling in the United States these days that existing negotiations to date with the Chinese government have failed, and that many of the commitments China has made in the past have not been fully implemented. So there's a trust deficit when it comes to re-engaging both on the U.S. and the Chinese side.
So let's talk about the worst case scenario, because having covered this story since the start of the year, at first I think people were thinking fairly optimistic outcomes, and now we're almost moving to the other end of the spectrum, and everyone is quite downbeat. So, we're hearing things about physical war, about economic accidents, about global recession. Mr. Huang, what do you think is going to be the worst thing that's going to happen to for both the U.S. and China?
Well, actually, I would not be willing to use the term the beginning of the end, but my guess is that actually we are sort of enter a new era when it comes to Sino-U.S. relations and the border China-West relations. Actually, I think a lot of people in the West now are rethinking upon the past 4 decades engagement policy and also its approach toward dealing with China. And actually, if you look at the U.S., I think the China bashing or anti-China now is one of the rare consensus areas in Washington D.C. which really unify the both aisles. So my sense that how we can just tell our story, use our own narrative to convince the world, particularly the West, that China's rise is peaceful, is not a threat to the current world order. I definitely applaud a lot of the international speeches remarks by Chinese leadership, particularly if you remember that the year before last, I think the presidency delivered a very aspiring, a speech at Davos, Winter Davos, and on many international occasions. I think those pro-globalization, pro-free trade announcement really must be coming, and that definitely match with domestic activities. So people talking about actually the mismatch between the words and actions. So my sense is that we need to really deliver on our promises, and really, so actually we see a lot of positive signals. Actually, for example, we just reduced the auto tariffs, import tariffs, and also with really loosen restriction on the whole ownership of the foreign services group in China. So I think those opening up measures really, I think, serve as kind of the positive signals to outside world that we really want to live up on our promises. And particularly, I think this year marks as the 40th anniversary of reform opening up. But I think we can really take advantage of this opportunity and this year to announce to the rest of the world that we are still embrace the globalization, and we're trying to reduce the gap between our words and actions.
And that's going to do it for this edition of The Point on CGTN. I'm Cheng sitting in for Liu Xin. Thanks for watching.